That's why you have more people, Rabbi. They
I
saw
guess so.
drugs.
Next week will be sex and then rock and roll, and we'll cover the holy trinity of popular topics. But this a little bit came as a kind of a challenge from my brother. My brother is a rabbi in Florida, and we talk shop often, and he knows I have a series called Rip from the Headlines. So, he always sends headlines and says, "What are you going to do with this?" So he sent this headline over, the first news item on the first source page, from where the image comes from. Customs agents in Cincinnati sees 44 pounds of cornflakes covered in cocaine instead of sugar. So he's like, I'd like to see the class on this topic ripped from the headline. So this one's for him. But I think it has some interesting other headlines. So the case in that in particular was that U.S. Customs and Border Patrol sees a shipment of cereal from South America that was covered in cocaine instead of sugar. CBP officers in Cincinnati, Ohio, intercepted the package on February 13th, containing a cocaine-coated cornflakes. According to a news release, the cocaine on the cornflakes weighed 44 pounds. Right? That's talk about breakfast being the most important meal of the day. Start your day with a hearty breakfast. This would be certainly be a very eye-opening, mind-blowing experience. All right, so that got me thinking. What about obviously drugs are dangerous, and we're going to see we know that Judaism reveres life and maintaining and preserving life. But so that got the gears rolling with regards to this type of topic. But I saw a couple of weeks ago also another, it was in the New York Times book review, entitled "When Getting High is a Hobby, Not a Habit." It doesn't take long to get what is perhaps the boldest and most controversial statement in Carl Hart's new book, Drug Use for Grown-Ups, Chasing Liberty in the Land of Fear. In the prologue, he writes, "I'm now entering my 5th year as a regular heroin user. In all honesty, I didn't know how to feel about this admission. It's not easy to square all that I've learned about this drug with the image I also hold of Hart, a tenured professor of psychology at Columbia University, an experienced neuroscientist, and a father. He's been studying the neurochemistry of different drugs for years, including crack cocaine and methamphetamine. He summarizes research findings in this way. I discovered that the predominant effects produced by the drugs discussed in this book are positive. It didn't matter whether the drug in question was cannabis, cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, or psilocybin. For those who aren't familiar with psilocybin, that's mushrooms, psychedelic mushrooms. The positive effects Hart cites include greater empathy, altruism, gratitude, and sense of purpose. For Hart personally, coming home and smoking heroin at the end of the day helps him to suspend the perpetual preparation for battle that goes on in my head, he writes. So here you have a habitual drug user who is not someone who's troubled. He's someone who is educating the future psychologists of the world. He's educating, Ivy League university, and it kind of was a little bit jarring to look at his, get home from work to-do list, which involves, a little heroin, a little crack cocaine. It's a little bit on the scary side, to say the least. But not only this idea that here he's talking about the positive side of drugs in terms of greater empathy, altruism, gratitude, sense of purpose. In my cultural references with regards to drugs, the one that stands out most, I still bring it back sometimes when it would be teaching students, is there's a famous commercial from the Reagan years where you have the sizzling frying pan. Right, and this is drugs. This is your brain on drugs. And they drop an egg in and it starts frying. Any questions? It's supposed to be self-evident that drugs are terrible. And here we have a different view on this from not someone who's in a cartel, or not someone who's troubled, but someone who has a more positive drug habit. And how does that play out? I don't know, if anyone else has any similar reactions or different reactions, but it's kind of, he's making the case for drug use. Obviously, there is a larger discussion with regard to legalization. The last item here, Murphy signs New Jersey legal weed bills ending 3-year saga. Right, this just came out last week. Also, that in New Jersey, Murphy signed the bills Monday morning without the usual fanfare, putting his pen to paper just before the deadline to take action struck. If he had done nothing, 2 measures seeking to launch legal marijuana industry and to end arrest would become law without his signature. Right, it's something that has been a long saga in New Jersey. It's able to come over into New York. It's already happened in other states as well. The idea of legalizing of marijuana and the idea of the conversation has been is sometimes often there with regards to maybe that's one way. If you regulate drugs the same way, look, people will claim that you have all sorts of other activities and substances which are harmful. Look at cigarettes or alcohol in general. These are also substances which can be dangerous, some more than others, but they're out there, they're legal. So do the same thing with drugs, especially if drugs can make your life better, according to this professor. So, obviously the cocaine of the cornflakes doesn't have much necessarily to teach us, but it gets the ball rolling. And these other articles, these other news items, where do we stand? What kind of wisdom do we have from Judaism with regards to this? And as was just mentioned, what about developing yourself as a human being? Will certainly be something that Judaism has a lot to say about, and we'll see in particular a very interesting comment of the Lubavitcher Rebbe on this point. But I think that let's as we always do, we've taken some headlines. Let's analyze things from the sources. The most commonly invoked source when it comes to anything which can be dangerous, we're certainly experiencing that in this year of COVID, is source number one, the pasuk in Devarim, v'nishmartem ma'od lenafshosechem. For your own sake, therefore, be most careful. And what's less well known is that this pasuk is not really talking about health per se. It's talking about being careful, but it's not talking about health, because it's coming within the context of mitzvah performance, connection to God, and following the Torah. And in particular, be very careful not to forget Sinai, not to forget the Sinai experience. And that Sinai experience was about only worshiping one God. Be careful, because that was the covenant, and you saw the covenant, you saw God speak at Sinai. It's not really within the context of take care of your health. It's about be careful of your soul. Right? We worry about the religious component of things, because Sinai was such a powerful moment, and Sinai was such a momentous experience upon which the whole covenant with God in Torah and Judaism was built. It's very important to be careful about it. However, the words themselves, nishmartem od lenafshosechem, ring very well and true when we're trying to come up with a tagline for be careful how you live your life, be careful, be safe, and the like. More often than not, the more appropriate verse in this with regards to for being healthy and things should be life affirming and not dangerous is the expression v'chai bahem, where the Torah, this is the verse in Vayikra and Parshas Achremos. We read it on Yom Kippur afternoon, that this is all the God references all of the mitzvos which I have given to you, v'chai bahem, you should live by them. And very famously, you should live by them and not die by them, that therefore life, pikuach nefesh, is the most important principle, is actually learned from that verse. But this one seems to offer a good springboard for be very careful, guard your soul, guard your health, guard the totality, engage only in positive activities. So that's the one that emerges. However, Judaism at the same time recognizes that not everything, you can't be safe all of the time, and sometimes always being cautious means you'll never go anywhere, never do anything, right? There are dangers lurking every time you step out of your front door, and so how do we kind of square the circle of that type of a challenge, that we have to be cautious, but we have to live our lives. So the Talmud, source number 2, Shabbat 129b, has an expression, Kiman dedashu be'rabim shomer pisayim Hashem. Since the multitudes have become accustomed to a practice, we can invoke the verse in Psalms, the Lord protects the simple-hearted. God guards God watches over the fool. And therefore, you ever see people engaged in crazy, people do crazy things, extreme sports, right? Bunch of idiots, bunch of fools, right? Well, God watches over the fools. Shomer Pesayim Hashem. And the Talmud references here, Kivan Didashu Be Rabim. Since people are actively engaged in it, in the activity, a lot of people do it. So even though it might be dangerous, even though it shouldn't be done, how is it possible that they're able to survive? Shomer Pesayim Hashem. God watches over the fools. This is an issue that is invoked with regards to one of the halachic conversation about smoking. Smoking, which is dangerous to one's health, and even it was something that was addressed halachically speaking by rabbis starting already in the 1950s and 60s when the dangers started to be recognized. This expression of the Talmud was invoked. Look, it's dangerous, but people do it anyway. And then maybe Shomer Pesayim Hashem. We're not going to forbid it. It's almost kind of the Talmudic or rabbinic excuse for being able to engage in things that you shouldn't be engaging in, because Shomer Pesayim Hashem. At the one hand, we're supposed to be careful. We're supposed to be safe. We're supposed to be healthy. On the other hand, people do it anyway. Shomer Pesayim Hashem. Hashem watches the fool. I've also, for example, it doesn't have to necessarily be the types of activities that we would consider destructive or harmful in the sense of these types of things. But I've heard this kind of a conversation involved with regards to going skiing. Going skiing can be very dangerous. People hurt themselves. Maybe it should be prohibited. Protect yourself, especially if you're not very good at it. But Shomer Pesayim Hashem, people do it. We're not gonna just sit around and not take any risk, because there's a certain risk that can be tolerated if it's the type of activity that people will engage in. If this sounds a little bit unscientific and fuzzy, well, that was something that Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach also noticed. Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, one of the great halachic decision makers in the later half of the 20th century, passed away in 1995. In source number 3, what's considered dangerous and what's not considered dangerous? How do you know? What are the boundaries? I also don't really know. I have a lot of doubt about this. But it would be logical to say, if most people run away and refrain from the activity, the same way they refrain from going into a dangerous situation, this could be something that's considered potentially life-threatening. And you would have to avoid this behavior in order to maintain one's health and one's vitality. If most people are not shocked and awed and afraid by that behavior, it's not considered dangerous from a halachic perspective. So maybe you have to go to the data. You have to look at the polls and look at the analysis. What types of fraught behavior are those examples that people are not afraid of? And which ones are they afraid of? Right? Plenty of people will have a drink after work, but most people will run away from crack cocaine. So you have that for Rosh Hashanah and Arbach. It's in the hands. We can't quantify it exactly, but we can look at what are the types of behaviors that people will completely avoid, which ones might they be willing to take a little bit of a chance, and it becomes a little bit of a numbers game. Just before I'll open up for questions, the Vilna Gaon, discussing this idea of responsibility to take a healthy approach and guard oneself from danger, notes that the source number 4, why are we being careful about this? Responsibility of the Jew is to appreciate the world that God has been good to us to grant us, and to develop a relationship with God and to fulfill Torah and mitzvos. Right? That's the goal. The last line, someone who's basically rejecting that which God has gifted us. There's nothing more heretical than this. The Vilna Gaon is saying to engage in dangerous activity is basically heretical, because it's a person denying their purpose, denying their mission in this world, which is to appreciate that which God has given us. So to take chances that may lead a person away from accomplishing that main goal, that's considered heresy. And so it isn't necessarily tied to a physical danger, but it's also recognizing our spiritual mission as well. So in terms of, we've seen, we have to be careful. At the same time, if people are doing it, it's not necessarily prohibited. This is very difficult to quantify, so maybe we have to look at just the general trends within society. If everyone's avoiding it, then it must be dangerous. If people are willing to engage, then maybe it's not prohibited. But it becomes part of our spiritual mission in this as well, not just necessarily the physical danger. Any questions or comments so far? I'll just open up for a moment.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
It's Robert. So it's interesting that you mentioned, good morning, Shavuot Tov. So it's interesting that you mentioned that, because I think there was a shir once also about boxing and wrestling. Are you able to go to those sports where possibility of, of being killed is, are you allowed to support those types of sports?
Right. Well, look, part of that relates to the danger. You're talking about, what about football? Plenty of football teams have Jewish owners, so there's clearly got to be something permissible there. But I think that there too, in terms of, these are things which are quote unquote legal. They're legal activities, right? These are legal activities. So maybe that's how we can understand Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach's analysis of this. If they're legal, then maybe they shouldn't be prohibited either. It doesn't mean you have to do it, but it wouldn't fall under the category of violating, v'chai b'hem and the like. And
what do you mean by legal?
If you'll get arrested by doing it, then it's also forbidden from a Torah perspective. Right, that factors into the idea of dina de malchusa dina as well. Right, the law of the land is the law, but I think that that's what we're going to see. In particular, we talked a little bit about the legalization of marijuana and how that fits in from a Jewish perspective. Just because something is legal does not necessarily mean it's permitted. But if something is legal, it might be harder to prohibit. We have to approach it from a different perspective.
But if the say the marijuana enhances the davening, makes you feel closer,
right.
Makes you feel closer to Hashem.
Right. You're right. So look, then it sounds a little bit like that Columbia professor, and then the question, becomes, whether just because you feel that way, whether that means it's actually genuinely appropriate. right? That whether that spiritual high that a person feels they get from a certain hallucinogen or from a narcotic, maybe, as the Vilna Gaon says, there's a more authentic way to try and have that experience. But we're going to see that in a couple of sources.
I actually have a comment, Rabbi. This is Tracy.
Hey.
So I would say with respect to addiction, I guess it's a little bit different than what you're talking about. If it the question is, does it consume someone's life that it's do all the time, and how does it affect others? For example, one's family. And I think
sure.
that factors in as well.
Right. So we're and that's a great point. And that actually the next when we pivot into the experiential component, the Talmud actually raises that type of a factor. I don't think it's necessarily coming at it from the way that we approach, addiction and how destructive it can be. But this is something that even in the Talmud they're aware of, that this type of behavior can lead off in a much more destructive way, even if it starts off simply enough. So it's a great point. Thank you. I see a couple of people in the chat have raised questions, right? And look, everybody was smoking. Well, it's not just let's not blame the rabbis for smoking. Everybody was smoking. Anyone ever you watch Mad Men? Everybody's smoking and drinking up the wazoo, right? That's how everyone was doing it. So everyone was doing it, and that's why they wasn't going to be banned. And that's why even when it became dangerous, it became hard to ban. Because how are you going to ban something that everybody's doing? Especially they were able to lean upon, as the Talmud says, God protects the fools. They shouldn't be, but they're doing it anyway. And you can say the same thing about COVID, right? Some people have an approach that they're going to be absolutely careful and not go anywhere or come into contact with anybody at all, and that's been their approach for the last year. And other people have cared a lot less. Which one is right? Leaving aside that everyone has to protect themselves and people will engage in risk differently. Just looking at the numbers is kind of crazy. There was a piece trying to understand, certain, morbidity rates in a place like the United States versus a place like, India, where you'd expect so many more people to have died and they haven't died. How come that's not the case? And, some people will look at that as proof that you can be less careful, and other people want to be more careful. There's a lot of unknowns, that this is not necessarily a science. As Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach said about danger, it's not a science. It's an art. It's something that you have to try and figure out, come up with an approach to.
Also, we had the mayor of New York who banned sugary drinks. Who thought that you could do that? Everybody drank Coca-Cola, but when you do it and you decide that perhaps we know more now and it's for the greater good, sometimes you can push things through over the objections of a lot of people who don't want to see that happen.
Right.
You should know for yourself, but people need to be protected. Right?
I think part of it may also become, what exactly is the substance? For example, smoking turned into a behavior, a concept that at least for a long time, the numbers seem to be, ticking upwards again. But, they banned smoking in restaurants, indoors. Can't smoke indoors anywhere anymore. That seemed to go over much more than the sugary drink ban.
It's interesting, Rabbi. In Long Beach, we have the yeshiva there, the Mesivta. And many times as I'm driving by or near there, a lot of the yeshiva boys are outside smoking cigarettes, I don't know what pressures they're going through.
Right. Oh, look, you can't judge a person until you walk a mile in their shoes.
Well, it's not a great commercial.
Correct. Look,
the sifter and guys smoking on the side,
Right. Look, as with other things, we're often we're sometimes quickest to notice, our own crowd who seems to engage in the behavior that we don't think they should be engaged in. There are plenty of non-yeshiva students who smoke too. Our antenna may be more attuned to our own, mishpacha who does that kind of a thing. But no, it is,
But so is
amazing.
everyone else's. So, you know, we
again,
we like to think if we're living a observant Jewish life, that we're showing good values, and
right,
people who
Hi, honey. I took a.
right, but I'm just not sure. I'm not sure that's. I'm not
Yes.
sure an observant Jew smoking is necessarily the same thing as an observant Jew who runs a
I'll be
Ponzi
able
scheme.
to help you.
I think that
Oh,
correct.
I think that there's sometimes. I think the latter is probably
So
yours.
it's Marada.
Right. There's Marisayan, and again, but Marisayan. I don't think Jew smoking is Marisayan for in the eyes of the non-Jews the same way as Jews engage in illicit behavior. Smoking is legal. I think that there's that determination also, that that distinction that we talked about before. Is it consonant with Jewish values, which is what we're talking about, and then it's also which is how we should optimize. And just reading another, in general, we feel that, Carla, like you mentioned, that Jews who live Torah lives and study Torah should be have refined characters. That doesn't mean that people who don't study Torah don't have refined character. We expect more from those who are committed to Torah values. That's an internal conversation. The external is, people see, Jews smoking. They see Jews smoking and non-Jews smoking. I don't necessarily think that people who see Jews smoking think, oh, they're Jewish, they shouldn't be smoking. I think that's not necessarily high on the value of if they see Jews who are, the example that we give the kids, about Kiddush Hashem is that when you go on a school trip to the museum, you better behave, because otherwise you'll be a Chil Hashem, because you expect Jews to behave nicer. I'm not so sure that applies to smoking just yet. Now, we may, based on what we have been studying and not engaging in this type of dangerous behavior, I think there's something to be said, the way Elliot mentioned his example. Suffice it to say that for the most part, rabbinic consensus these days seems to tilt towards saying smoking is prohibited because it's a danger to one's health. Mm-hmm. At the same time, it's one of those, so is overeating and not exercising. There are other types of behavior, but I think that because smoking has such a cultural prominence, it's something that I think has taken. It's been harder to eliminate. And especially if we're going to lean on the health arguments, that may impact that discussion about narcotics as well. Yes, Phyllis.
But the object of this discussion about engaging in behaviors that may not be illegal but are not good for us. We're discussing it on a Torah level, so shouldn't we be saying, do as I do rather than do as I say, with regard to yeshiva students smoking and Rebbe smoking? And
again, I think that's great. I'm not going to ask whether who smokes and who doesn't smoke, on the Zoom. I think that as I was just saying, smoking is so much entrenched in the behavior, and it's also, Tracy raised the idea of addictive behavior. Also, it's not something that people necessarily have as much ability to control. I think that whether it be the rabbis who smoke and can't stop, so how are they going to be able to tell their students to stop, versus the students who can't stop, versus the cultural influences. 100%, I agree. Don't smoke. I think it's forbidden to smoke. It's dangerous. There's no, the larger question is how can society allow it, right? I love when, especially in Europe, if you stop in the duty-free stores, this may kill you. They're not shy about the warning labels that they put on the cigarette cartons and the alcohol. Society allows us to kill ourselves, and that just complicates the question. But 100%, no one should leave this year thinking that it's Jewishly permissible to smoke. If you do smoke, that's the decision you've made. It seems to be against Jewish law and Jewish values. At the same time,
Certainly
there are
not on
plenty
Shabbat.
of other types of behavior that we may be engaging in that isn't that we're not supposed to.
Rabbi, fortunately for society, smoking has been decreasing in population, and we should listen to science. We may not all be able to adhere to what the principles of science are telling us, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try to foster what science is telling us and try to abide by it if possible.
Absolutely. Although I think the smoking numbers are ticking upwards. Certainly.
Not what I heard. Not what I read, Rabbi.
All right.
I haven't read that at all.
Yes, Aviva.
I'm going to bring this back to something that keeps on coming into my head, but I don't know if it's related. Like Prushim, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, there was an interpretation in Judaism that forced people to think one way or another. And it's the way, in a way, I'm thinking of COVID. I said, I'm not going to judge anyone how they behave because they're working from their rubrics of what decisions they made, and I'm working from a different set. So is there a thinking from the rabbis that if it's legal and we don't think for the most part it's going to kill people, is that something that it'll have its boundaries eventually, but for now we go with it?
Look, I think that very succinctly sums up the tension. We're supposed to do what's good for us, but if people are doing it anyway, then maybe it's not bad for us, right? That's the Shomer Pesayim Hashem conundrum that's introduced. Again, if it's if it's forbidden, right? You can't say people eat ham sandwiches, so we can eat ham sandwiches. But if it's an activity that seems to fly in the face of an ishmartem, of being helpful, but people do it anyway, it seems that goes all the way back to those Perushim that you're referencing, that they had it was challenging to outright forbid, right? So I think that has been the conundrum. Look, there was the article I was reading about, Jewish ethical behavior. So they tell a humorous story, taking place in a Eastern European yeshiva that there was a common, icebox in the fridge, whatever they had, that someone, the students kept, a couple items, and then one student had his milk container there. And day after day, it commonly happened that someone was taking his milk. And they were using his milk, and he wrote on it, "Don't touch." He wrote in big letters, "Don't touch." He wrote on it, the Torah says not to steal, and it still gets taken and taken and taken. Finally, one day he writes on it, "This milk is not Chol of Yisrael," and then they stopped taking it from him. The fact, that it wasn't the legalistic obligation that stopped the person; it was the more pietistic stringency about it not being Chol of Yisrael that stopped the person. So I think that we can't ignore that also influences religious behavior. Look, you talk about with regards to if cigarettes had pork tips on them, it would be easier to prohibit it. So there is that tension that exists, and I think that tension has been there throughout. Just we're talking as we shift over in terms of how. In terms of legalization, just an interesting historical note, source number 5 is talking about the Shabbos lamps and Shabbos candles and lights that we have. So it says that one should not make the wick for a Shabbos lamp, whether it is the lamp on your table or any lamp that you light in the house, from something that the light does not come from the wick itself, for example, wool or hair, but rather for that which the light comes from the wick itself, for example, flax, cotton, or canvas. Cannabis. It's translated by some as hemp, but cannabis, it looks like they were lighting cannabis. Now, cannabis doesn't mean they're smoking marijuana, but there have been linguistic analyses in terms of this idea that cannabis was used in the ancient Near East in the vicinity of Israel. It wouldn't be surprising necessarily that this was a material that the rabbis were familiar with. And the Jerusalem Post, they just recently had first evidence of cannabis being used by ancient Israelites has been discovered after researchers found well-preserved cannabinoid residue on an altar of a shrine in ancient Israelite temple, according to a study published in the Journal of the Institute of Tel Aviv University.
Made for
Cannabinoid
Noy
residue
Shabbos.
indicative that Israelites use cannabis for religious ceremonies. Researchers recently discovered this after analyzing unidentified dark material found on one of the two altars of Judahite shrine, the ancient temple of Tel Arad in the Negev. So, maybe it was something we're familiar with. It has, there are some suggestions. It's nothing determinative or definitive at all that one of these spices in the incense may have been cannabis. But so it's something that rabbinic literature can be familiar with. So yeah, someone had a question.
I said it enhanced their Shabbos.
Huh? Well, look, the idea of, smoking was certainly, and I think Elliot referenced it before. The idea of smoking in a spiritual context is certainly found in the stories of the Hasidim. We have no indication as to what they were smoking, but there's certainly stories of of the Hasidic gatherings and the Rebbe speaking after smoking on his pipe, et cetera, et cetera. Yes.
Rabbi, so ripped from the headlines today in the New York Post, New Jersey law shields pot and booze kids. Governor Murphy signed a law that prohibit police officers from telling parents that their children are in possession of marijuana.
Right. This, this legalization activity, is something that, again, it's not about necessarily everyone's desire to engage in them. Sometimes it's about tax revenue. There's a financial stake in a lot of this. Sometimes it's about, in terms of civil society, the thinking that if it's regulated and decriminalized, it becomes less of a temptation for illicit activity, right? What's the expression that stolen waters are sweeter? Mayim genuvim yimtaku. All right, now it's legal. It's no fun anymore. People will have to, they'll go back to school instead of engaging in the drug sale. There is that, but there's always been that the push towards legalization. It used to be seen more as a progressive endeavor. Just source number 8 is from a transcription of one of the tapes from the Nixon White House. It's a funny thing. Every one of those bastards that are out for legalizing marijuana is Jewish. What the Christ is the matter with the Jews, Bob? What's the matter with them? I suppose it's because most of them are psychiatrists. Right? Nixon didn't have the nicest things to say about Jews in a lot of these tapes that were released. But, look, legalizing drugs, at least in his conception, was a Jewish issue. But I think that, how Judaism looks at these types of activities in general, and then in particular, if we talk a little bit about legalization of marijuana and drugs in general, reference the idea of addictive behavior. We saw this source a couple of months ago in a class. But Gemara in Psachim, Rav said to Chia, his son, do not get into the habit of drinking medications. Don't drink medications. Why not, said Rashi? Because you're going to get addicted to them. Your heart's going to desire them. You're going to want them more than when you actually need them. So here there was the concern about even medication. And we know, look, a prescription medication, there was a horrific scourge of these types of drugs and abuse and addiction that came from this. The whole, pharmaceutical industry was up in arms, and there's lawsuits and criminal charges and the like, because of something that the rabbis realized in the times of the Talmud. You need to be careful, because if you go down that path, you may never be able to recover. But with regards to, Judy talks about the Post today, and we saw, New Jersey is heading towards legalizing marijuana. So the OU, Orthodox Union, had a statement of medical marijuana. You remember, I think Colorado was the first state to legalize, I think about 8 years ago or so. And, one of the things that starts emerging is that marijuana, and you can have, different, it's not just for smoking, it's an ingredient, and they have what are called edibles that you infuse it into different foods. The question of what about kosher supervision emerges. So the OU, Orthodox Union that grants kosher supervision, was called upon to supervise the kosher status of some of these products. Now, if you have leaves and you smoke them, that's one thing, but often there's processing that takes place, and cooking and drying, and there are questions of kashrus which can emerge, and then there are the ingredients. So the OU said back in January 2016, source number 9, there's been much confusion and misinformation about these products, and the OU has received numerous communications expressing surprise about the OU decision to grant certification to marijuana products. Two main concerns have been expressed. A, OU endorsement of marijuana products may create an impression that recreational use of marijuana is acceptable, and this may lead to increased use of marijuana or other addictive substances. And B, OU products designed for medical use will most likely make their way into the wrong hands. While these concerns are understandable, they reflect a misunderstanding of the nature of these products and the manner in which they are dispensed. Essentially, the OU was interested in providing kosher supervision to medical marijuana and not recreational use marijuana. That was not something they wanted to go in that direction. One of the other types of destructive behavior which can have a kosher issue, you may have heard of Juul, J-U-U-L, kind of a vaping. It's a type of way to smoke, but there are all sorts of tastes and the like. And kosher certifying agencies have rejected any involvement in these companies. They've been approached to give kosher supervision to these products so that they'll become more popular to the kosher market, especially as has been noted, there are those who smoke. So the kosher agencies have rejected being involved in anything like that because of the destructive nature, the dangerous nature of the product. At the same time, they do still give kosher certification to things like gribbinus, which could also be dangerous. Fried chicken skin, not good for the cholesterol, but the OU has stayed away from recreational marijuana kosher supervision. Really, the most explicit issue that came up with regards to marijuana was Rabbi Feinstein had a response in the 1960s. Source number 10 about those asher hischilu eze bachorim mehayeshiva la'ashen hashish marijuana, as it says there in the parentheses. So what about that? Pasha shu davar asur mikam ikari dinim sheb'torah. He said it's prohibited. Chadashu mekalko mechalas saduf, it's bad for the body. Afinim su anashim briim shalamazik lahem kol kach. But what about people who are not adversely impacted by it? Mekalko hu esadas. It plays with the mind. You can't optimize your understanding. Basically, Judaism wants you to have a clear mind when engaged in Torah study or davening or any mitzvah like tzedakah, if it impacts the mind. It makes you want more. It has a desire for a substance, not like food, but that you need, but something that you don't need. And some people develop an addiction to this. And he invokes the wayward son, who one of the crimes of the wayward son is having a desire and appetite, even those appetite for things which are permissible. This type of an appetite, which can be an addictive appetite, is problematic and dangerous. So you're not allowed to be involved in this. We're supposed to be holy. He says it's absolutely forbidden. We're supposed to be models of behavior, and this is not the type of behavior. So people have kind of pushed back and said, well, for some people, it can, look at our Columbia professor. You wouldn't call him a degenerate or someone who's a negative member of society. So I thought that a little piece by David Brooks when the marijuana was being legalized, talks about this level of, a certain type of refinement that is expected. Rabbi Feinstein invokes it with regards to Kedoshim Tihiyu, about being holy, as the source for it. And there's a certain refinement which is expected. Brooks writes, source 11, the people who debate these policy changes usually cite the health risk users would face or tax revenues the state may realize. Many people these days shy away from talking about the moral status of drug use because that would imply that one sort of life you might choose is better than another sort of life. But of course, there are the core questions. Laws profoundly mold culture. So what sort of community do we want our laws to nurture? What sort of individuals and behaviors do our governments want to encourage? I'd say that in healthy societies, governments want to subtly tip the scale to favor temperate, prudent, self-governing citizenship. In those societies, government subtly encourages the highest pleasures like enjoying the arts or being in nature, and discourages lesser pleasures like being stoned. In legalizing weed, citizens of Colorado are indeed enhancing individual freedom, but they're also nurturing a moral ecology, which is a bit harder to be the sort of person most of us want to be. And that last expression rings into a comment that the Lubavitcher Rebbe said in a letter in the 1960s, source number 12. I have received of your letter of October 18th, which you write in the name of your friends in your own behalf, asks my opinion regarding the new drug, LSD, which is said to have the property of mental stimulation. Biochemistry is not my field, and I cannot express opinion on the drug you mentioned, especially as it is still new. However, what I can say is that the claim that the said drug can stimulate mystical insight is not the proper way to attain mystical inspiration, even if it had such a property. The Jewish way is to go from strength to strength, not by means of drugs and other artificial stimulants, which have a place only if they are necessary for the physical health, in accordance with the mitzvah to take care of oneself. Hope that everyone will agree that before any drugs are taken, one should first utilize all one's natural capacities. And when this is done truly and fully, I do not think there will be a need to look for artificial stimulants. Right? The type of person we want to be, we should first be trying to strive for our own, certainly permissible ways to get there, but also the path of what has been presented to us as the tools to get there. Our minds, our hearts, our souls, our religion, our values. Those might be better ways to have greater empathy, altruism, gratitude, and sense of purpose, as opposed to any of these other stimulants. So I think we touched on some issues, and obviously this issue will continue to rage in society, and hopefully we certainly all I know is when this came out, it gave Schulz a brand new tagline for Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, to come get high on the high holidays. But hopefully we'll find more. We'll find more natural ways to find spiritual and emotional and physical fulfillment. Happy to take any other questions or comments.